So I think we can start now. Thank you so much for coming to my talk today. I have two parts to the talk, with the first part being more of a summary of the contents of the book, and the second part built actually on a previous talk I had given on certain aspects of my work. And so my apologies if some of my points repeat, but I did my best to interpolate transitionary passages that will hopefully ensure a fluid and organic flow from one portion to the next. So, if you would like to know everything there is to know about medievalism and nationalism in early 19th century German opera, here's the book on it. The project was built on my PhD dissertation. My first foray into this topic actually occurred with my master's thesis when I did a study on musical medievalism and Richard Wagner's operas. I expanded upon this topic by including other composers in my study like Carl Maria von Weber, Heinrich Marschner, Franz Schubert, and Robert Schumann. Just a little bit more context on my initial interest. I noticed that Wagner had a lot of operas set in the Middle Ages, and I was curious if he had been inspired by actual historical medieval music and his portrayals of quote-unquote medieval music on stage. So that was the initial research question that led to this whole, the whole project. To start with, medievalism refers to the reception or interpretation of the Middle Ages. It has also been referred to as the continuing reinvention of the Middle Ages. And as I mentioned, I noticed that Wagner had set a number of his operas in the Middle Ages, and it had me wondering about the significance of the Middle Ages in the 19th century. And it also made me wonder how Wagner chose to portray music from medieval times, and whether that presentation was based on any historical awareness or of actual medieval music, or if it was all imagined and made up. As I continued to investigate this topic, I came to realize that not only Wagner, but a host of German opera composers in the early 19th century had operas with medieval settings, leading me to conclude that interest in the Middle Ages was not just Wagner's quirky interest alone, but a society-wide phenomenon. This society-wide interest in the Middle Ages in the early 19th century, 1800 to 1850, that's the main time frame of my study, in Germany, is what I explore in my first chapter. And if you turn in your handout to book contents, it's the first page. I have the chapter titles for you listed. The first chapter, German Opera, the Rediscovery of the Middle Ages and the Building of a Nation. And such an interest in medieval times in Germany at this time went hand in hand with the growing desire for a unified German nation, as Germans looked to their own past as a source for cultural roots and national identity. The concept of a unified German nation at this time was a tricky one, and they actually did not unite as a nation until 1871, so well after the purview of the time frame which I'm studying. For Germany at this time was not a single unified cultural entity, but rather comprised an assortment of different states and principalities with their own unique cultures and dialects. They were, of course, united by the common German language, but there was lots of variety from dialect to dialect. Just as an example, I can't understand a word of Bavarian dialect, even though it's technically, a variant of German, but it almost gets to the point that it seems like a completely different language, some of these dialects. All Germans can speak High German, which is like the lingua franca, and then they have their regional dialects that they know as well. As the Parisian Madame de Staël stated in 1810, quote, "The Germans are Saxons, Prussians, Bavarians, Austrians, but the German character, on which the strength of them all must be based, is as fragmented as the land itself, which has so many different rulers," end quote. Thus, interest in the Middle Ages went beyond mere historical fancy and was actually an important component of the nation-building process. This is where opera enters the picture, because at this point in history, the French and Italians dominated the opera world. German composers increasingly desired to forge their own German language grand opera tradition in the first half of the 19th century, which coincided with burgeoning nationalism. It is no surprise then that many German opera composers chose a medieval setting for their operatic works. Eventually, in the second half of the 19th century, Wagner would come to monopolize the German opera repertory, and his name basically became synonymous with the genre. You could say, even to this day, that is still the case. However, in the first half of the 19th century, again 1800 to 1850, there remained a healthy competition among composers to forge a uniquely Germanic operatic repertory, which is why my study focuses on this particular time period in German history. But rather than do an exhaustive study of as many German operas with medieval settings written between 1800 and 1850 that I could find, I decided to instead focus on 6 key works as case studies. Although, if you would like to see what the other operas there were in the German language at this time, I do in my book have a medievalist German opera table that runs for a few pages, which gives information on composer, date of premiere, site of premiere, librettist, plot setting, etc., etc. So you can see just how many operas there were with medieval settings just through that alone. The 6 works I singled out them out either for the significance of the work itself or the significance of the composer. The title, Medievalism and Nationalism in German Opera, Euryanthe to Lohengrin. So we start with Euryanthe by Karl Maria von Weber. This is an opera that came out in 1823. This work did not have nearly the same commercial success as Weber's Der Freischütz of 1821, which I'm sure you all know, especially from the Nam, right? These are history students, very good. But, so this work was not as successful, but later composers revered it, and it had a marked influence on all the operas in my study, with the exception of one that was written around the same time. 2 works by Wagner, Tannhäuser 1845 and Lohengrin 1850, are featured not only for Wagner's enormous musical influence on German culture, but also for his influence on cultural perceptions of the Middle Ages through his operas. So that's a chicken or the egg kind of thing, right? That he's helping to shape views of medieval history through his works. Heinrich Marschner, a lesser-known composer today, but quite popular in his time, made a big impact with his 1829 Der Templar und die Juden, or in English, The Templar and the Jewess. Robert Schumann, although regarded today and then as a great composer, did not find much success with his only opera Genoveva of 1850, but due to his artistic stature, his work had built up much attention and anticipation around the time of its premiere. And then, lastly, an operatic work by Schubert, Fierabras of 1823. For this work, I feature as a gateway to drawing connections between medievalism in opera and medievalism in the Lied, or the German art song, of which Schubert wrote many. Schubert also, coincidentally, wrote many operas, although only a couple were staged in his lifetime, and not a single one maintains a spot in the repertory today. So if we look at the list of chapter titles in your handout, you will notice that rather than devote a single chapter to each individual work, this book is organized around 3 key themes that unite all 6 operas in their treatment of the medievalist musical aesthetic: minstrelsy, or medieval song, Christianity, and chivalry. And I actually had some pushback from a reviewer about this organization, but I stuck to my guns, because the reviewer thought I should do 1 work per chapter. But I felt that was too old-fashioned. I want to do something a little more heavy next time. Inspiration for such an organization arose in part from Marjorie Hirsch's book, Romantic Poetry and the Search for Lost Paradise, in which she writes that, quote, the veneration of classical antiquity is more commonly associated with the Renaissance and Enlightenment than German Romanticism, many of whose adherents showed a predilection for the medieval world of chivalry, minstrelsy, and Christianity, end quote. For minstrelsy, I investigate on-stage portrayals of Minnesong, a genre of German medieval secular song, which was essentially the German version of troubadour song in the Middle Ages. I use the more generic term medieval song for chapters 2 and 3, though, because minstrelsy refers more specifically to troubadour song and the like, and less to folk song. But folk song is another important component of the Romantic medievalist sound world, which I explore in chapter 3. Therefore, I use the term medieval song to encompass both types of song. The term Christianity refers naturally to onstage portrayals of church music, and chivalry, the musical portrayals of 19th century conceptions of masculinity, heroism, and nationality. All 6 operas in the study embody these 3 themes in one form or another, but some embody certain aspects of each theme more prominently. Each chapter thus features certain works and focuses more closely on how that work exemplifies the theme of that chapter. Now, I'm going to play excerpts from Wagner's operas and from Weber's opera later in the second portion. So as I go through these other works, I'm going to play some excerpts so we can familiarize ourselves a little bit with those, with the music from those operas as well. So chapter 2 examines how Weber and Wagner chose to portray the medieval secular genre of Minnesang in their operas, as I mentioned, Euryanthe and Tannhäuser respectively, and includes an examination of the historical information on Minnesang that they had available to them. Chapter 3 explores the significance of folk song for medievalist German opera and includes an investigation of some medievalist lieder and folk-like song moments in Schubert's Fieravras. Folk music provided a sense of continuity with German's ancestral past, based on the common belief that folk songs had their origins in medieval times. Later, like I said, I will go more into Weber and Wagner, but we're going to listen to Fieravras. So in Fieravras, for instance, we hear the Maiden's Chorus at Act 1, Scene 1, which is a strophic and folk-like number in the opera. Schubert, so here's an example of folklorism as a reflection of the medievalist aesthetic of hearing an opera. So Schubert, through the course of the number, weaves the key scheme back and forth between C major and minor and G major and minor in order to preserve the simplicity of the strophic structure while maintaining the listener's interest. As we know, strophic settings are very repetitive, so they have to find ways to keep the music sounding fresh and interesting. The preservation, or one might even say illusion of simplicity in such a moment is paramount to Schubert's portrayal of a simple folk song ostensibly heralding from the distant past. This number sounds both old and new, and simple and complex through the combination of seemingly antiquated folk song-like forms with up-to-date compositional techniques, as evidenced in the key scheme. That would be the up-to-date compositional technique. Now, we will not hear the workings out of the different keys in the excerpt I will play, but the folk-like qualities of the number shine through even just in a cursory listen from the beginning of the track. So this is, again, from Act 1 of Schubert's Fieravras. As loud as I can make it. So there are all sorts of hidden gems like these in Schubert's operas because they're no longer really often performed works, but there's wonderful music in them nonetheless. Chapter 4 features a close examination of Robert Schumann's music historical knowledge, as well as his employment of a Protestant-style chorale in the style of Johann Sebastian Bach to portray medieval congregational worship in his opera Genoveva. Bach, not from the Middle Ages, right? Not exactly. I should give a little bit of context, though, that they didn't really have clear ideas at this time of when these eras took place, like when the Middle Ages were. There was a lot of different information about when those eras were, and they didn't even really have as clear a concept of the term Baroque yet for the Baroque era, but these things would continue to develop over time. But in any event, music in the style of Bach might seem an odd choice for depicting medieval people, as Bach was part of the Baroque era, not the Middle Ages. But given the strong nationalistic associations between Bach and the origins of German music history, with Bach at this time being viewed as the cornerstone or grandfather of German music, Schumann may have alluded to Bach in his opera as an idealistic portrayal of the origins of his culture's music and his desire to establish a Germanic operatic tradition. The chorale, sung by the onstage chorus in the opening of Act 1, vividly portrays a homogeneous German community singing with one voice as one people in a musical style inextricably connected to their own heritage and identity. The superimposition of an anachronistic chorale on people of the Middle Ages may represent an attempt at reclaiming the German Middle Ages from the Latin Church. Or as a Protestant himself, Schumann may have felt personally invested in promoting a Protestant vision of a united German nation through his use of a Lutheran chorale in his opera. Let's listen to that chorale. This is the beginning of Act 1 of Euryanthe. So we've heard some folk-like music, church idioms as well. You're probably wondering also about the more chivalric or robust style, which we'll hear in the next example. So chapter 5 examines two of the more commercially successful works in this book, Marschner's Der Templer und die Juden and Wagner's Lohengrin, and investigates on-stage portrayals of traditional gender roles and archetypes, along with their significance at this time for nationalism. In Der Templer, Marschner, for instance, employs a musical style that evokes images of a martial and masculine medieval past in his opera. One particularly virile section of the opera that embodies the style occurs in the Act 1, Number 3, War Song of the Saxons, in which the Saxon knights sing, "He who has strength and courage in his breast does not fear iron nor steel." Marschner pairs the martial character of the text with music for male chorus that features strong, dotted rhythms and a forceful sounding G minor. The martial and heroic character of the music serves to evoke both an idealized Middle Ages as well as an idealized national past. you also hopefully noticed the German language being sung, which the German language alone is a signifier of Germanness, you could say, or it's a nationalistic gesture at this time as well, because the language for opera was either Italian or French at this time. So that too is also an important component as we're listening to be aware of. The concluding chapter 6 looks at the post-1850 drive towards German unification and situates Wagner's 1868 opera Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg in that process in order to demonstrate how many of the historicist medievalist features contained in Meistersinger had their roots in medievalist German opera of the first half of the century, like the ones that we're listening to here. Chapter 6 also addresses modern stagings of some of these works to examine how directors portray outmoded 19th century medievalist nationalist values in these operas in a way that does not alienate modern audiences. Martin Cuget, for instance, staged Schumann's Genoveva in 2008 at the Opera House in Zurich, Switzerland. And in this staging, Cuget managed to both revive Schumann's all but forgotten opera and also to comment on the medievalist nationalism in a way that would seem to speak more to contemporary audiences. Or if medievalist nationalistic themes in opera strongly attracted 19th century audiences, those same themes, particularly given Germany's troubled history with nationalism in the 20th century with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, almost certainly push most contemporary audiences in the opposite direction. The bishop that calls men to arms to defeat the invading Moors at the beginning of Act 1 of Genoveva, for instance, is portrayed in Cuget's staging as a wild-eyed religious zealot who childishly wields a sword, showing his character to be completely out of touch with the militaristic campaign against the foreign enemy. The relationship between the main characters Siegfried and Genoveva, the noble male-female pair in the storyline, is depicted as contrived and inauthentic as Siegfried repeatedly kisses her on the forehead and she faints and stumbles, suggesting that they are merely play acting the role of the noble pair. Likewise, when the final chorus sings the praises of the noble pair at the end of the opera, this was a common trope at the end of these types of operas, the glorification and uplifting of the noble pair. The onstage chorus can be seen wielding a variety of weapons, including axes and bayonets, making them appear more as an angry mob than a jubilant throng. The medievalist nationalist ideals expressed or implied in the original work, unreflective religious faith, fear of the foreign enemy, militaristic and chauvinistic chivalry, and the glorification of the noble male-female pair, are thus exposed to the staging as inherently flawed and embarrassingly naive. Cuget's production therefore appears to both be reviving the music while also confronting what may be considered uncomfortably nationalistic content, even if veiled under a seemingly innocent medieval setting. So that's the first portion. Now we're going to transition into the second portion of the talk. And in this portion, we're going to go a little more deeply into the rest of the handout. I'm going to dive into medievalism as a concept and into a few moments in Weber's and Wagner's operas that I think best encapsulate a medievalist musical style that occurs in these operas, and what we can pinpoint as specifically medievalist about such passages. Annette Kreuziger-Herr, whom I had the immense pleasure of studying under while carrying out my dissertation research in Germany during the 2012-2013 academic year, identifies 4 principal categories of musical medievalism in her Grove article on medievalism. This is seen in your handout, 4 types of medievalism in music. The categories, while distinct, often overlap, and they include creative, the production of new works of art, reproductive, the reconstruction of medieval works, scientific, the study of the medieval using methodologies considered authentic, and ideological, the exploitation of the Middle Ages for political or ideological gain. In Western Europe in the 19th century, an interest in all things medieval, instigated in part by the success of literary works of historical fiction, like Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe of 1820, permeated all sectors of society, particularly in the arts, but also in politics. Just as an aside, Marshner's opera, The Templar of the Jewess, is based on Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. In 19th century Germany specifically, the medievalist aesthetic, as I previously discussed, carried strong ideological and political significance as Germans looked to their medieval past to develop a sense of national and cultural identity and their quest for a unified nation, again not to be obtained until 1871. Here's the repetitive part of my time. But it's good to reinforce, right? Although the various forms of creative medievalism existed in the 18th century and continued into the 19th century, the 19th century witnessed the rise of historicism and a strong desire to understand the Middle Ages as people thought it actually was. So you could make a distinction here between medievalism, which, although it encompasses lots of different aspects of recreating the Middle Ages, whether understanding the real Middle Ages or just the fantastical version, you could see medievalism being as somewhat occupying that space more of fantasy, whereas historicism would count as more serious historical inquiry. And that was kind of the way I used these different terms in my dissertation. That's one way you can kind of approach this, but you can still understand actual historical inquiry under the umbrella of medievalism as well, like reproductive medievalism, for instance. So there's different ways we can parse terms, but so this led to more reproductive medievalism at this time, and rediscoveries and reconstructions of medieval works of art, literature, and in a few cases, music. And scientific medievalism also rose up at this time, as for example, when the architect August Richardson desired to have the Cologne Cathedral completed strictly according to the 13th century medieval design, and even through the use of tools and materials that 13th century builders would have had at their disposal. This was in the 19th century, right, that he was wanting to have I should do an aside on the Cologne Cathedral. So the Cologne Cathedral was left unfinished. It was initially started in the 13th century, and it was left unfinished for centuries. And the unfinished cathedral was actually a symbol of Cologne. There was a crane, a wooden crane that was sitting at the top for hundreds of years. And then finally, in the 19th century, they wanted to complete the Cologne Cathedral. It was eventually completed, I think, 1881. And so this was part of that process of how are we going to finish this design, and the architect that I mentioned, August Richardson, wanted to be true to what tools they had at their disposal in the Middle Ages. So you can see in a case like that a very strong desire for historical authenticity, right? To be true to what history actually was according to the information they had. One of the arguments that I'm pushing in my book is that the composers of these operas were also interested in this kind of historical inquiry. That although you could say that most of it was made up, that doesn't mean that they weren't trying to recreate history as they thought it might have actually been. And it also doesn't mean that audiences wouldn't have assumed that what they saw on stage was like a real window into the past. Because opera was this very dynamic genre where you could actually like experience medieval times by going to the opera versus just like listening to it or watching. I mean, it was like the Gesamtkunstwerk, right? The total work of art. It really brought the past to life, which is another reason why why opera I think is important to focus on in a study like this. So as with creative medievalism, all three were creative, scientific, and reproductive, were driven in part by the ideological medievalism associated with nation building and Germanic cultural identity formation. That's a pretty obvious example of ideological right there, woven into this whole discussion. But despite some cases of reproductive and scientific medievalism with regards to rediscoveries of music of the Middle Ages, the bulk of which would not take place until the 20th century. So that's an important point. Most medieval music, like actual music in manuscripts, was not going to be discovered until the 20th century. So they didn't actually have a lot to go on in the 19th century by way of real, quote-unquote, real medieval music. They did have some books on music history, like Charles Burney's History of Western Music and things like that. But a lot of those descriptions of medieval music were kind of idealized in a way and less quote-unquote scientific by at least today's standards. Like there was a passage from Burney saying he had a Minnesong melody and he said, this melody is so noble and so much more noble than the earlier one. And it was a complete subjective assessment, right? I mean, what made it more noble? He didn't really go into detail. about what was more noble about it. But these are the kinds of things you would encounter in these 18th and 19th century music history books. So with that being said, most portrayals of medieval music among composers, not just in Germany in the 19th century, but throughout Western Europe, would represent a creative form of medievalism. So that is chiefly what we are dealing with in this time period. Fascination with medieval times was indeed a key component of the Romantic aesthetic, and artists of all types often depicted the period with many of the same stereotypes that exist today, including virtuous maidens, noble knights, pious monks, courtly love, and homogeneous societies in which people were more in tune with nature, social and divine hierarchies were trusted and respected, and gender roles were fixed and unequivocal. In the absence of substantial evidence or sheer knowledge of actual music from the Middle Ages among composers writing medievalist works, certain semiotic musical codes developed that were meant to evoke an aura of the distant past. So this is really the bulk of my study. I'm looking at what those codes were, what the musical language was for portraying music of the medieval past, or even just old music from some distant epic in distant history. Many such codes had their origins in music of the 18th century, but their more frequent and consistent use among 19th century composers led to a certain type of chivalric, or more generically, medievalist musical style that could be heard in instrumental works as well as in vocal genres like the lied and opera. Richard Wagner, one of the leading figures behind the medievalist aesthetic in music and in art in the 19th century, utilized to great effect some such musical codes, and his operas Tannhäuser and Lohengrin, 1845 and 1850, just as a reminder, provide some of the best demonstrations of his desire to recreate a medieval sound in his works. Unlike his post-Lohengrin works that take place in a more mythical, historical realm, devoid of a fixed setting in a real-time place, with the exception of Die Meistersinger, of course, Wagner sets the stories for Tannhäuser and Lohengrin in specific locales and at specific times in medieval history. So think the ring cycle. It's not really clear when the ring cycle takes place. It's just some nebulous, mythical way back when. So Tannhäuser takes place in Thuringia, which is a state in Germany in the 13th century. Lohengrin takes place in Antwerp on the Scheldt at the beginning of the 10th century. Creative medievalism is particularly evident in Wagner's recreation of medieval minnesong during the song contest scene in Act 2 of Tannhäuser. Now, there is a scholar who made the argument, and if we could, let's turn to the next sheet here where we see Wolfram von Eschenbach's minnesong Act 2 scene for Tannhäuser. Notice in the beginning of the melody where we have a string of repeated notes, right, where he's kind of sitting on G for a while. There is, and many would see this as probably alluding to the liturgical reciting tone, right? Or possible allusion to that, which would connect to Christianity as being another signifier of music from the past or music from the Middle Ages. This is the argument that I am sticking to in my book, that I think he was probably alluding to the liturgical reciting tone, if anything. But there is another scholar by the name of Larry Bombach who made the argument in an article that Wagner was actually alluding to real historical minnesong melodies with this pattern because he had a book in his possession prior to completing Tannhäuser that did contain actual facsimiles of minnesong melodies. And the scholar noticed that in these minnesong melodies from the actual Middle Ages, he noticed a lot of these repeating note patterns. He claims that, because he did acknowledge people could say this was referring to liturgical reciting tone, but he said that these patterns occur more at the beginnings of poetic lines rather than in the middle, which would be more a feature of the liturgical reciting tone. So he is and I will say he very carefully suggested it could be the case that there was actual historical influence going on here. And I think it's very compelling. But I think we're stretching it a bit. We definitely cannot say that definitively. But it's an interesting, very fascinating conjecture that could be the case. And in any event, despite this hypothesis, this, I would say that the bulk of Wagner's musical language is of a 19th century Romantic character, with particular stylistic signposts that would suggest music of a distant epoch. This is getting into what I was talking about the semiotic codes for music from a distant past. So sticking with Wolfram von Eschenbach's Minnesang, and I'm going to explain how I think this plays out. Sticking with this Minnesang that begins the song contest in Act 2, the melody itself may suggest an antique sound with Wagner's use of repeating notes to evoke potentially a liturgical reciting tone, while the voice and harp timbre is an unmistakable signifier of the medieval bard singing his epic legends and lays. The relatively square and straightforward rhythms may also serve to suggest a simpler, archaic musical style. But the harmony evokes an antique musical aura as well, in my view. So if we turn to the following page, the instrumental introduction to his Minnesang, Wolfram von Eschenbach. In the bars leading up to the instrumental introduction to Wolfram's Minnesang, one hears a half cadence in B flat major. I'm going to get a little bit of music theory here, so let's see if we can follow along as much as we can. I will fault you if you lose the thread a little bit. So one hears a half cadence in B flat major, and indeed the F chord is so heavily reinforced in this section that when the ear picks up the first chord of Wolfram's lead as a B flat major chord, one is convinced that the song will remain in that key. Fancy way of saying, we believe this is in B flat major, this song, right, when it starts out. That first chord is pictured here. Now, the chord following B flat in the few bars of music for strings that begins Wolfram's song is a G minor chord, which reminds one of relative major and minor key relations. The alternation between relative major and minor keys, and even the very harmonic progression of 1 to 6, both appear rather frequently in medievalist musical works, including the medievalist operas Richard Coeur de Lion by André Modeste and Euryanthe by Carl Weber. And they appear to form a kind of harmonic signpost to the listener for music that heralds from a distant land or time period, at least as I am putting forth in my study. But rather than staying in B flat, Wagner slithers around harmonically in the next few bars to make B flat the dominant of E flat major, which is the key in which Wolfram sings his song, confirmed in the E flat major arpeggio in the harp prior to Wolfram's entrance. And all of that is taking place here. And you can see the different ways you can analyze these chords based on whether you're in B flat major or B flat major. Such tonal obfuscation and the string and harp timbre make the music here sound dreamy. And the passage can be heard as a kind of doorway opening to reveal a wondrous glimpse into the golden haze of the mythic medieval past. Moreover, Wagner reinforces the 1 to 6 harmonic progression as heard in the opening when, after sitting on B flat for 7 bars of Wolfram singing, the first new harmony heard is a C minor chord, 6. Okay, let me play this for you. So we're looking at the beginning here, and then once he starts singing, we're going to be back to this melody here. If you can hear it, it's going to be a little soft. I have it as high as I can get. Convinced? I know, it's like I said a lot and then I played it, so it might be hard to keep it all in line, but hopefully you're a little bit convinced. It should be noted as well that the famous Pilgrim's Chorus melody, heard at the opening of the overture and other parts of the opera, also begins with a harmonic progression of 1 to 6. And I will play the moment for you here. Go to where it's loud so we can hear it that way. Okay, so I was demonstrating for you the harmonic motion of 1 to 6 there. I do not believe such harmonic motions are coincidental, but rather self-conscious tools on the part of the composer for the evocation of an antique sound. I have a little bit more, and then we'll get to Q&A. Wagner's Lohengrin in many spots portrays a type of chivalric musical style, one that we already encountered in Marschner's opera, that scholar Jonathan Bellman describes in regards to medieval works by Robert Schumann and Johannes Brahms. Bellman sees the central musical characteristics of this style, of the chivalric style as he understands it, as comprising, quote, fanfare figures, horn fifths, trumpet call repeated notes, and in general, clarion melodic lines that stress chord tones in a triumphant heraldic manner, end quote. He goes on to describe other features such as, quote, a galloping 6/8 meter, or continuous triplets in a brisk common time suggestive of hoofbeats, end quote. As with Tannhäuser, some evidence exists for scientific or reproductive medievalism in Wagner's desire for the onstage Herhornbläser to resemble, quote, and this is Wagner's sketch for his desired onstage trumpets for Lohengrin. And he said he wanted to resemble, quote, 4 brass, long, trombone-like instruments in their simplest form, like we see the angels of the resurrection blowing in church paintings, end quote. But again, the bulk of the musical material represents the creative type in the manner of a chivalric style that was described in part by Bellman, and to which I would include such features as the 1 to 6 harmonic progression and other aspects that I will now address. If we turn to the assembly of the vassals, see that, 1 to 6? I'm not making this up, it's everywhere. The assembly of the vassals in Act 3, Scene 3 contains many features of a chivalric sound, including heralding trumpets and an opening harmonic progression of 1, 6, 3, 4, with the 1, 6 progression running is again a frequently appearing harmonic progression in Tannhäuser and other medieval works of the time. Let me play this for you. This passage is going to start, I'll try to find where that starts. 25 seconds in. It sounds almost like something you hear in a film score to an Indiana Jones movie, doesn't it? By no accident, because these codes were set in place already in the 19th century, and then film composers were building on these types of tropes and things of that nature. A chivalric tone is also evident in the prelude to Act 3 of Lohengrin, the opening of which sounds so similar to Weber's overture to Euryanthe that it may be considered an homage. This is the last page of your handout. There it is again, but we've got a little intermediate 5 dominant chord in between. It's very short though, so I think my argument still stands. So I will play the overture to Weber's Euryanthe first, and then the prelude to Act 3 of Lohengrin, and pay attention to their similarities. Okay, now here's Prelude to Act 3 of Lohengrin, featured in Euryanthe. So kind of a chain of influence going on there, I think. So in both pieces, the major key, diatonic harmonies, brass and timpani, and the general boisterousness and energy of the music seem to evoke a rugged and masculine or chivalric musical character, while the half notes and dotted eighths seem to suggest the stateliness and nobility of the medieval court. The gendered context of musical medievalism here is equally significant to the genre and the time period. For around the beginning of the 19th century, a, quote, hardening of gender identity categories, end quote, according to scholar Matthew Pedd, and a hostility towards a female presence in the arts permeated German society. As I mentioned previously, part of the allure of the Middle Ages in the first half of the 19th century involved the idealization of an era in which gender norms and dichotomies were seemingly fixed and unequivocal. In the 19th century conception of medieval gender roles, men were seen as active, vigorous, rough, and valiant, whereas women were viewed as soft, passive, chaste, and compliant. This then represents another example of an ideological type of medievalism outlined by Annette Kreuziger-Hare coming to the fore. With strongly ideological type of medievalism with strongly nationalistic undertones. And so once again, the crossover among the different types of medievalism outlined by Annette Kreuziger-Hare comes to the fore. Now ultimately, despite my argument for creative medievalism being the most important form for understanding musical applications of the Middle Ages in the 19th century, and in Wagner's and Weber's operas in particular, all the different types seem to be working closely together in artists and composers' depictions of what 19th century people viewed as the real Middle Ages. Thank you.
Why do you think composers and artists chose, whether consciously or subconsciously, to be so obsessed with the medieval era and not I don't know, the Greeks or Romans, or just why was it medieval that they just?
Well, they were obsessed with the Greeks too. They were obsessed with a lot of things at different times. Yeah, so this is a theme we talk about in music history. Every era is trying to recreate the ancient Greek ideal, right? Yeah. That was certainly going on in the Romantic era as well. But the Middle Ages took on a more nationalistic kind of significance to Germans in particular. And actually, this was Europe-wide, but Germany in particular was probably the most taken by the Middle Ages in this time period than the rest of Europe. And I think it had a lot to do with that nation-building process. Yeah, they were looking to their own past to build their sense of identity. And actually, I didn't talk about it in this presentation, but one of the ideas I posit is that the Middle Ages to the Germans of this time represented the non-exotic other, because it is different in that it is historical and way back when, but it is showing aspects of their own identity, and so it's both other and non-other at the same time. So it's an interesting kind of phenomenon going on there. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So what's your opinion on the evolution of German opera from, we started with the Schindspiel, and even before in the Baroque period there was some operas like Telemann and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And also the relation between what's German opera and what would just be considered Austrian, or something like that. They're kind of similar, but technically not.
Well, we have to consider that the distinction between Austria and Germany was not really a thing just yet, because it wasn't until Germany became its own nation that they were excluding Austria from that. But there was a lot of debate about, was Austria part of the national project or not? So when I say Germany at this time, I just mean German-speaking Europe, essentially, which would have also encompassed Austria. If we go back to the Baroque era, we see German opera composers generally writing Italian opera, right? So this is also kind of why I'm highlighting these operas, because this is the first time they're really trying to establish a German language genre of opera and tradition, to move away from the hegemonic Italian and French form of opera. Yes.
So are there far more German operas than French and Italian that deal with medievalism and nationalism?
No, there's lots of French and Italian operas, like I'm thinking of, well, the À la Vie, La Juive, or even the Troubadour by Verdi, Il Trovatore. So, yeah, you see it throughout Europe and all types of operas from different nations. But I think we see it even more among the Germans, especially at this time. And that was really what really sparked my idea to turn this into like my PhD dissertation. Is every time I encountered a new German opera, it was almost always set in the Middle Ages. Like when I found Schumann's opera, I was like, of course it's set in the Middle Ages. So I had to, well, I didn't have to, but I was very inspired then to follow this thread because it just seemed like it was so predominant and such a strong trend, more so than other countries. But yes, good question. Yeah.
Is the attempt, does that sort of have anti-Semitic overtones, undertones? And is it done today, the market?
So, Ivanhoe, the novel, so I read Ivanhoe, and I was actually kind of bowled over by how anti-Semitic that novel was. And anti-Semitism, I don't think, shows up quite as overtly in Marschner's opera, but there's, I mean, you know, anti-Semitism was so prominent in the 19th century that there was like probably casual anti-Semitism in there that would have just been part of the course. That was a topic that I was kind of, you know, a little bit, I wouldn't say avoiding, it does come up, but it's kind of a whole other like can of worms, like dealing with anti-Semitism in Germany and how it appears in German opera. Of course, you have people who would argue that the ring cycle contains anti-Semitic stereotypes, like in Albert the Dwarf and things like that, even though Wagner never stipulated that clearly that it was meant to be that. Scholars have argued it would have been so obvious to a 19th century audience that these were anti-Semitic stereotypes that wouldn't have to have been said out loud. So, yeah, I think there is unavoidable anti-Semitism in a work like Marschner's opera, but I don't think that was Marschner's, like, I don't think that was at the forefront of what he was intending, unless if it was just kind of a byproduct of nationalism. And Marschner himself I dug up a few quotations from him where he was expressing quite a good deal of nationalistic zeal in his discussion of German opera. So it's easy to think of Wagner as a big bad guy in all of this, but that's not necessarily the case. That he was, people like Marschner, Schumann too, Brahms. I mean, Brahms didn't write opera, but he also, a German requiem, you know, for instance. So I think a lot of times scholars try to just peg Wagner as the problematic one, but I don't think it's that simple, you know. But we also don't want to just reduce it to that either, you know. And I think there's a lot to explore on these works that you could even say that my study is somewhat reducing these works mainly to their medievalism and nationalism, but there's so much more. I'm mainly doing that just to kind of highlight a trend that I've noticed. But that was actually a reviewer's objection, was that he felt that I wasn't showing enough how these works portray diversity and style and message and things like that. But that's a work for the reviewer, I think. This is what I do. So it's a whole thing. Yeah, that's just the tip of the iceberg of that whole discussion. But thank you for the question. Yes.
As opera was predominantly like Italian and then French, when these German operas started coming up and they have more so German history and nationalism in the themes and plots of it, folk music, what effect does that have, if any, on sort of their reception in other countries? Like, were these ones that would have been interesting to people in France, would they have wanted to perform there as well?
So that's a good question. The German operas, like pre-Wagner German operas, most of them didn't really go far outside of Germany, right? They were popular within Germany, But I think it had a lot to do with the fact that they were in the German language and they were based. I mean, maybe Freischütz might be an exception to that because Freischütz was internationally successful. But it wasn't until Wagner really got big that German opera really had established itself on the international scene. So I think prior to that, it was more kind of a local kind of type of entertainment, I would say.
So does medievalism in German opera like stop as we start getting after World War I or pre-World War I? Like, because I know there's like works by Arnold Schoenberg, Berg, the famous ones by Berg, that don't really have to do anything with medieval themes and everything. They were dealing with really gruesome things. Yeah.
So what was there a question there?
So when
just
does
a
it
comment?
like stop, like this kind of influence in German opera?
Say again, sorry.
Where does it stop? Like,
Where does medievalism stop?
like, or like
Oh.
increasing popularity?
It doesn't stop. In fact, if
No.
you look at my medievalist German opera,
No, I got the whole book.
1998 is where I stopped. Schneewittchen by Heinz Holliger.
Oh, okay. So
And I could have kept going. There were more, but I decided to
so
end it at
it's
the
still
end.
persistent outside of the 19th century then?
It's not what, sorry.
It's still persistent?
Oh yeah. It's persisting everywhere. Look at all those films with medieval themes, right? Game of Thrones. I mean, it's everywhere. It's not going anywhere, let's put it that way. Yes?
Have you noticed any kind of more modern music using the same kind of like the harmonic thing you were talking about from the 1 chord to the 6 chord? Have you noticed what kind of modern music have you noticed using the same codes that they use?
Absolutely, I have. So, do you all know Two Steps from Hell, Thomas Ferguson, that kind of epic orchestral music you see on YouTube? You see a lot of this stuff in that. So pretty much any music that sounds like epic, or we would describe as epic or heroic, or just, boisterous, or all these things that I kind of pointed out, you see a lot of similarities there. You'll see a lot of 1 to 6 in those. Which is why I like those pieces too, because I like 1 to 6. So yeah, absolutely. And then what I would like to happen is that people would make that connection, that they would read my book and realize, oh, wait a second, these things were happening in these modern works as well, right? So it's like they're laying the groundwork for it this time. Yeah. Yeah, so many different facets to this, so it's really never ending. I could go all day about this stuff, but I will stop it here. We do have refreshments, unless there are any more questions, or?
I was going to say Brahms' Magalona Lieder, the
Right.
15 Antique, which is
Definitely.
He didn't do opera, but he did that.
Yes, and I do talk about his Magalona Lieder. So we're on page 130 if you find the book. So in Brahms' Magalona Lied, Traumbogen und Pfeil, the author Bellman, so Bellman describes a harmonic move of 1 to flat 7. That's another one, besides 1 to 6.
That's the second sonnet or fifth?
I'm not sure. I don't say it here.
Oh,
But in any event, yeah, that's another, so like the absence of the leading tone, that was another kind of feature of the medievalist sound, because then it alludes to the early church modes, the prior to the advancement of, major and minor keys and the leading tone and all that. So Bellman describes the harmonic move of 1 to 7, a flat 7 chord, major 7 chord, in Brahms' Lied as clearly archaic and reflective of the composer's chivalric style. So yes, you're absolutely right. Brahms is in the game too, just not in opera. Yeah. So it's never ending, all this stuff. I hope you found this as fascinating as I do. Thanks for coming.